Hello and welcome to today's bulletin of Daily Debrief, brought to you by People's Dispatch. I'm Swastika. Now, our first story continues with our coverage on the situation in Ukraine. Tuesday and Wednesday saw a number of countries impose various sanctions on Russia. These include the US, European countries, Japan, and Australia. Now, the sanctions follow Russian President Vladimir Putin's recognizing the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics and ordering soldiers into these areas. The LPR and the DPR are held by pro-Russian separatists. Now, one of the more significant punitive actions was by Germany, which has called a halt on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. To understand more about this, we have with us Prashant. Prashant, if you could tell us what do these sanctions, the nature of these sanctions right now are all about, and also how will it impact Russia?
Right, Swastika, so we'll come to Nord Stream separately, but let's take a look at some of the other sanctions. So we do know that on Tuesday night, Joe Biden spoke. He announced a limited set of sanctions, gave the impression that there could be more. We've seen the European countries agree on a package, Japan, Australia. No idea why Australia is involved in this, or Japan for that matter, but they are. So it seems like a open season for sanctions. Everyone thinks that they can impose sanctions. But the important thing to note is, as of now, a lot of these sanctions still seem largely symbolic, in the sense that most of them are applied on lawmakers, for instance, who approved the decision to recognize these two republics, that is the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, independent republics, which was what led to Putin's decision. Yes. So the lawmakers who voted for that, they have been sanctioned. There's been some action against some big Russian oligarchs, so to speak, preventing them from, say, maybe, accessing some services in Europe. Certain Russian banks, for instance, have been sanctioned. There have been announcements that any commercial activity in the DPR and the LPR, which is these two independent republics, will also be sanctioned. So it's a fairly, as of now, it still seems like a fairly limited set of actions. Now, this could be due to two reasons. One is that the fact that America, the United States, the European countries might want to keep bigger sanctions for future in case they see, or in case anything which to them seems like an escalation happens. Now, that's one possibility. The other possibility is also that I think there is also recognition that any serious attempt to strangle Russia economically will also have an impact on Europe as well. So there's also recognition that any serious attempt to strangle Russia will also have some kind of an impact on Europe as well. So I think the West is also in a bit of a conundrum in terms of what action they can actually take. And this, I think, has been reflected the situation in this context from the very beginning, because you see that the United States and the Western powers, they have been making all kinds of threats and all kinds of warning. For one, they talked about war breaking out any moment, which never happened. Even now, let's be clear, there's been no war or invasion for that matter. Point number two is that the fact that they've been promising the worst kind of sanctions, the most powerful package of sanctions against Russia if Russia does even moves. But the fact does remain that the close economic ties between the Western Europe and Russia automatically mean that it's actually difficult to impose those kind of sanctions. They might be able to target some sections of the some sections of the Russian economy, some sections of the Russian political establishment, some sections of the Russian elite. But beyond that, it is it's still a bit difficult. Now, again, this is very open-ended right now. One of the issues that we're talking about is by the time we if we finish recording and the episode is up, things might have drastically changed. So we can never say, what might happen in the next coming hours, in the next couple of days. But I think as of now, the West is still, there's a lot of rhetoric, very aggressive and very problematic rhetoric. But I think in terms of concrete measures, it remains to be seen if any of these will actually affect Russia very well.
Well, one of the concrete measures was what Germany has done. So if you could tell us more about with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, how will that impact the Western powers?
Right. So important thing about the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which is a couple of things. One is that the United States has long wanted to sabotage this because this would have meant a much stronger energy relationship between Russia and the European countries, especially Germany. Okay. So the US was in many ways dead against it. They've been trying to prevent this for a long time. So this is if the Nord Stream 2 pipeline is permanently halted, this is a great achievement. This is a big achievement for the United States. On the other hand, it's important to note that what has actually been announced is a pause in the certification of the pipeline. This does not mean that the pipeline is stopped or it's going to be dismantled or anything of that sort. It's a halt. And one would, I would tend to believe that in the coming years, maybe for instance, or even months, we might actually see a resumption of that once tensions cool down, in whatever capacity that happens. It's important to know that right now there is no gas from Russia going to Western Europe to the Nord Stream 2 pipeline because this is still a project that hasn't been commissioned yet, right? So this is still a project that is yet to go into operation. So that's an important thing to note. But and there's already existing Russian energy supply that is coming via Ukraine, Poland, etc. to Western Europe. Now, if that is touched, now that's a different matter because then both sides are really getting into a much more dangerous game if any of those energy supplies are affected. But the Nord Stream 2 pipeline itself, again, seems slightly more on the symbolic side for me as of now. Now, if this halting and the pausing continues for a long term, then this could actually have a heavy impact. I would still think that Western Europe is going to be as much affected because there are a couple of things. One, of course, it's not only Russia's money, as experts have pointed out. There are many other European companies also involved in the construction of this project. So that's one thing. Secondly, the whole point of this Nord Stream 2 pipeline was to improve energy supplies to Germany. And in fact, you've actually recently seen in many countries in Europe, there have been protests by people's movements against rising energy bills, the possibility, especially during winter, that there is, that the energy prices are going to soar. There is not really enough energy to soar. And for many of these Western European countries, gas was the way to actually transition from the more polluting fossil fuels into a green energy environment, so to speak, or ecosystem, which again is a big issue in Europe. So this is not only an external affairs problem, this is actually a very domestic problem. So a Europe where they are not able to transition into more clean energy, a Europe where very high energy bills exist, is a Europe with a huge potential for internal chaos. We're talking about governments that might face instability because of these reasons. Yes. So I'm skeptical about the fact that the Europeans, especially the Germans, would in the long run want to basically scuttle Nord Stream 2. The United States wants to. It has a different agenda altogether. But I think the Europeans are probably not very keen on it. So we need to see whether this is actually going to become a longer halt or a longer pause in the coming months. My hunch is that at the sign of things cooling down, once an equilibrium is reached, which hopefully it will be because nobody wants war, once an equilibrium is reached, I think the restoration of Nord Stream 2 will be one of the first items on the agenda because, like I said, I think the Europeans probably needed more than the Russians because the Russians have an alternate market in China.
Okay. Thank you for those details, Prashant. Stay with us. We'll move on to our next story. The Communist Party of Swaziland has called for unity against Ms. Swati's killer police following the latest brutal attacks on high school students. The party condemned the police violence and called on supporters to stand in solidarity with the students against the police brutality. Swaziland, also known as Eswatini since 2018, has seen mass youth-led democracy protests sweeping across the country since last summer. Now, the protesters are demanding the unbanning of political parties, which have been outlawed since 1973, and an end to the rule of the South African nation's absolutist monarch. Now, coming back to you, Prashant, for more on this, if you could tell us a little bit more. We've been covering this issue constantly on People's Dispatch. So if you could tell us a little bit more about the struggle at this point of time.
Right. So the latest incident comes after the fact that police attacked school students, high school students, in the northern part of the country. They were eating popcorn which was laced with some intoxicants. Nothing, not a big crime. In fact, such intoxicants are legal in many parts of the world. But the kind of repression and atrocities which were perpetrated were very scary. They used stun guns on some of these students. They forced students into this torture pose where you have to sit without a chair. So this kind of physical torture poses. So this kind of repression that the police in Swaziland have been meting out towards all sections of the population is actually very illustrative, and the Communist Party is called for greater unity. It's important to note because it has been in the forefront of many of these struggles against the monarchy of Mswati III. And this might look like one incident, but it's important to note that the students' movement in Swaziland has actually been the hub of a lot of struggles over the past couple of years, especially last year. So there is this. So there is this sense of wantonness and repression which the police are bringing clearly to the table against students, which even minor things are being punished in a. So it's in some senses almost like all-round anarchy and all-round anarchy and brutality that we're witnessing against innocent students in various parts of the country. So it's not surprising that the party has given this call, and this is, like I said, this is in the context of recently, over the past month especially, we've seen a number of reports, both People's Dispatch and New Frame from South Africa have carried very important reports on the repression of the student community in Swaziland. The very important leader of the Swaziland students movement, the president of the SNUS, was arrested. He was granted bail on February 4th after massive protests, after students took to the streets and made it clear they would not allow the government to continue functioning if he was not granted bail. But even in the days before that, which the New Frame report has a lot of details of, there were a lot of instances of students being kidnapped, students being forced into various, put in jail, being tortured, being beaten up, tasered. There was an instance of a student water was poured on him, and then laser guns were used, for instance. So these kind of atrocities continuously taking place in the country because the students and various sections have the audacity to ask for a democratic country, which in today's world, of course, seems passé, but actually in Swaziland, the struggle is one of the most intense struggles that is going on now. The campaign is called Democracy Now. It's been going on. It is especially intensified in 2021. We can talk about that a bit later. But students have been at the forefront of many of these campaigns. And so it is not, in some sense, it's not surprising that this kind of vindictiveness is being meted out against the student community in general, and these protests are taking place.
So there have been other mobilizations that have also been taking place. What are the balance of forces?
Right. So, Swastika, if you look at the last year especially, what we saw was that there was a massive upsurge that happened in Swaziland. And what distinguished last year's protests from the previous protests, there have been many protests over the past few years, is the fact that this was one of the first round of protests which not only took place in the urban areas, but which also moved into the rural areas.
Okay.
So this was a significant shift when it came to the nature of the protest movement in Swaziland. And like I said, a lot of this was under the larger banner, or the larger rubric of the Democracy Now campaign. And it brought together students, of course, like we talked about. It brought together civil servants, it brought together trade union activists, for instance, teachers, doctors, all of them banding together, all of them bringing together their own sets of grievances. Grievances to do with pay, grievances to do with work conditions, grievances to do with academic issues, grievances to do with freedom of expression in general, which all of them face. Right, and a lot of these people came together with various grievances under this larger rubric of this Democracy Now campaign. In this context, the response of the government needs to be noted because it was just pure brutality, pure repression. I think between June and July last year, I believe about 100 people were killed. Mswati was forced to flee the country. Mswati III, important that you mentioned, he's an absolute monarch. The nature of his absolute monarchy is quite absolute, for lack of a better word, because he has complete control over all the levers of the political system in Swaziland, and even the parliament, so to speak, is essentially a rubber stamp parliament, where the traditional tribal chiefs who are allied to the king have a lot of say in who comes to parliament, etc., etc. And even the few members of parliament who are open to speaking their mind, who are willing to listen to the people. A couple of them, for instance, have been thrown in jail. And what were their crimes basically over the past year? They accepted petitions from their own constituents who came to talk about some of the issues they were facing. And for that reason alone, they were persecuted. I believe the two of them are still in jail. So there was widespread repression that we saw across the country in 2021. We have had multiple reports in People's Dispatch of that. And despite all these attempts at repression, there was continuous mass resistance on the streets. So an important thing to note here is, of course, that Swaziland's neighbors have not played a very constructive role on this, especially South Africa, other countries. They have actually given Mswati a fair amount of leeway. They have tried to sort of play a placatory role, try to behave as though this is not an exception, because this is clearly an exception, right? This is not what you see in the 21st century in general, an absolute monarch doing this kind of repression. But they actually, on the other hand, have sorted, and I think the Communist Party, other organizations, have actually condemned the attempts by the regional powers, by countries in the region, to sort of give some more space to Mswati and allow more space for more maneuvering room for him, because each time Mswati has been given that space, he has only responded by unleashing more repression. And we're already talking about a country where there's a massive amount, and this is again the reason people are protesting is also because some of these issues are so obvious. The amount of money Mswati spends on his personal indulgences, on personal luxuries, while 70% of the country is in extreme poverty, that itself is a massive scandal. So we're not even talking about larger questions of, say, allocating this much percentage for healthcare and education. We're talking about the fact that a large part of the country's budget, a substantial part of the country's budget is being used directly for the king's personal pleasure and luxury. Yeah. So these kind of issues are the ones which the people of Swaziland are continuously flagging, they're continuously fighting over. So I think that this year specifically, and hopefully this year, we don't know what's going to happen in the future, is going to be a very key year for Swaziland as far as many of these struggles are concerned, because as time passes, I think the situation is becoming increasingly more and more untenable for Mswati, and there is only so long that in a small country with a limited amount of resources, the repression he can unleash can go unchecked.
Well, we'll keep covering the issues that will crop up in Swaziland. Prashant, today you just have to stay with our bulletin because we'll be coming back to you for our next story as well. Moving on to our third story. A year into his social media exile, Trump is working to get back online. Former President Donald Trump's long-promised social network, Truth Social, has been almost entirely inaccessible in the first day of its grand debut because of technical glitches. A 13-hour outage and a 300,000-person waitlist. This platform promised it would revolutionize social media and take down the mainstream social networks. But early glimpses at Social Truth suggests its offerings are almost identical to what Twitter and other sites have offered for years, except tweets are called truths and retweets are called retruths. Now, Prashant, ironically, when Donald Trump has an app called Social Truth. Truth Social. What do you do about that? It's quite ironical.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think we talked about this a couple of months ago in this very show itself, and expressed our incredulity that such a concept could even, such an idea could even exist in today's world. Trump having his own social media platform and all that. And the interesting thing is that the execution of this platform has, blown up all those expectations. It's much worse than anybody could have anticipated. You mentioned the waiting list, of course. You mentioned the difficulties in signing in. There's been some extensive media coverage of the various fiascos that have taken place. Among the other facts that it is basically entirely a rip-off of an already existing open source social media platform. They've just taken the code and probably tweaked it around a little bit to give it a new appearance. And of course the fact that some of the spoofs and satirical websites made based on that are apparently working much better than Truth Social itself. So this, I think, is a perfect representation of what the Trump world is, so to speak. And it's interesting because in some senses it's a larger legacy of Donald Trump. It was a combination of the worst kinds of incompetence and the most dangerous kinds of venomous politics, which is always what Trump brought to US politics in some senses, in the sense a combination of these two things together, and which is why so many people try to really struggle to confront it, because on the one hand there was no way of adequately confronting the venomous social politics that he was bringing, and on the other hand the sheer incompetence also sort of threw a lot of people off. And in fact many people have always been worried that the next great Republican leader, right-wing leader, could be somebody who is Trump minus the inefficiency. So keeping that aside, the fact is that this is a classic example of how the Trump world functions. Clearly it's a complete mess. Whether this will serve any purpose, whether this will be of any use is difficult. We'll come to that later.
Yes.
But I think this is the point here is very simple, that this is completely anticipated. First of all, the attempt was to really create their own right-wing ecosystem, so to speak, and that is not an easy job, and that has clearly failed.
In fact, is this his way of staying relevant? I mean, what's his point?
Right. So I think, Swastika, this is a far more complicated question, because let's just move this thing out of this Truth Social out of the picture, because this is somewhere between a farce and a joke. So, let's move that out of the picture. But I think the larger project here is something else entirely, which is that Donald Trump is in a very strange position, in the sense that on the one hand he has this vice-like grip on the Republican Party, right? So all those who predicted that with Trump's defeat in the 2020 elections, Trump would just vanish away and the Republicans would return to some so-called glorious past where they were reasonable people, they were all completely proved wrong, because Trump and Trumpism are both here to stay. Even if Trump is not there, Trumpism is clearly here to stay, because the Republicans have discovered the benefits of that kind of hard right political stance that that got concretized during the years of Donald Trump, right? So Trump that way does have a hold on the Republican Party. So yeah, his role in the January 6, 2021 uprising, where his supporters stormed the Capitol, and then of course there are a lot of financial issues, and one can be sure that there are a lot of skeletons inside the closet as well. So for Trump, it's a very thin line, I would think, because there, on the one hand, like I said, there is this kind of political dominance he holds, but it is on a very flimsy ground.
Yeah, he's a weak foot.
Right. So the important thing for someone like Trump is to sort of make sure that he's able to rally and continuously charge and mobilize his support base, right? To show that he is relevant to the Republican Party and to the American political situation in general, because the moment it appears as though he's dispensable, that's it. There will be people coming from all over who will basically destroy him, right? So that's very important to note, because his entire thing right now, I would think, rests on this continuous sense of being able to convey the fact that he is a force in American politics. And that requires a continuous charging of his base. So we do know, for instance, that when he even delivered a slight pro-vax message recently, all his supporters turned on him. So that is how precarious sometimes Trump's situation is. So I think the social media experiment, for instance, or many of these other things, the kind of statements he makes are all attempts to sort of keep this reality in mind, keep this, are all attempts that are made be keeping this reality in mind, that is a very precarious line, that at any point a Trump-like figure, but far more organized, far more, menacing, far more efficient, could come and just basically completely dethrone Donald Trump and take things forward. That possibility is always there. And there are, I'm sure, a lot of Republican politicians who are actually grooming themselves or preparing themselves for that, because the Republican Party is clearly ripe for being led by such a figure who's deeply problematic, bigoted, racist, and divisive. So the Republican Party is perfectly ready to be led by such a figure. So far, that figure has been Trump, but there could always be somebody else. So I think in some ways these attempts are also defensive actions by Trump to sort of maintain his position. If he can somehow, take it to 2024, become the Republican nominee again, we do know that the Democrats are going to face a very tough fight. They're in a very bad situation. Yes. If somehow, for instance, for Trump, if he can come back, that really is his agenda.
Well, Prashant, thank you for all the details that you've joined us on. That's all we have on Daily Debrief today. Do come back tomorrow and keep following us on People's Dispatch. Thank you.